at the outset, as we let this guest introduce themselves, we are going to apologize. So let's let them introduce themselves.
Hello, I am Drisana Levitzke-Gray. This is how you sign my name. And I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm quite excited to see how we go this time.
So, Gus, what happened last time, mate? Come on, Gus, give it to us.
We had the opportunity 2 years ago, probably longer maybe, to chat to Drisana. And when we recorded the interview, you might have heard about sign being mentioned there. Drisana is profoundly deaf, and we're actually talking to Drisana through her interpreter, Christy. They're using Auslan in front of us, which is obviously going to be shown on YouTube and on our Instagram. However, when we first recorded this a couple of years ago on Zoom, we had it on the record mode that it was speaker only. So that meant that myself and Dylan were being filmed. Our interpreter, Christy, was being filmed, but Drisana was not, because Drisana doesn't use, I don't want to say like your voice. I don't want to be rude. What's the best way to describe that, Drisana? Sorry.
I guess it's because it's a voice-based recording. That's how all that works.
I guess we can reference it as voice and not language. I guess that's fair. Hopefully that's fair. But yes, so unfortunately we didn't have Drisana, and of course, being an accessible podcast, we couldn't release that episode in audio-only form. We wanted and needed to have that online and captioned as well, so everybody has the conversation. It's so important as well, this episode, for people who do use Auslan or sign language as well, to be part of this conversation. So Drisana, a huge apology and an even more gratuitous thank you for being back on the podcast. It means a lot to us, and hopefully the rehearsal was just the lead up to this great interview.
That's right, exactly. And thank you so much for having me back as well, because I know people asked me about that interview because a few people knew it was happening, and I was like, there's been technology issues, there's nothing terrible happened in the interview. It wasn't canned. But, and again, often we don't have the same opportunity to have interviews, because often, if it's done through radio, we don't have the same avenues. And often we need to wait for technology to catch up to certain things. When people started using Zoom quite a lot, we as deaf people often knew the capability was there, but if you didn't have the right settings in place, that's the kind of thing that quite commonly happens.
Now, before we get into yourself, Drisana, and you were very humble in your introduction of yourself, because you are a baller, which I love. But this is something I love doing when Angus is here, all right? Hands up if you have won a version of Australian of the Year. And our hands are up, Drisana and myself, Gus.
I should also mention a big thank you to our interpreter, Christy, who can't put her hand up either, because we haven't had such accolades, but we would like to reference Christy being here. But yes, both of us haven't, which means only 50% of the conversation has.
It's just you, Angus. No, we don't mention the interpreter. It's like they're not here when you ask, which we'll get into that. We'll talk about that. But this is pretty much just about you, my friend, Gus. But nominations are open.
No.
I know, but nominations are open. Do you reckon you're a chance?
No, I'm not. I appreciate that, though.
But definitely, please nominate. We do want more deaf and disabled people in these awards. We have, there's so many hearing able-bodied people out there, but there are just as many deaf and disabled people doing incredible things. And we often have to, it takes us a lot more to do exceptional things. And so well done, Dylan, for being recipient of the Australian of the Year. And mine was back in 2015. And I think that, that allows us a platform and to ensure that deaf and disabled people are represented in the community.
There is one thing we could do better. I'm going to pull you up. You're being very nice. And Angus, this was an accident, but talk us through just very quickly, culturally, referring to interpreters when they're there. You're not supposed to do that. You are supposed to do that, just so people know, because I knew that. And often you see like a politician or an MC get up and they're like, by the way, before we do this, how awesome is the interpreter or whatever, right? Can you just talk us quickly around that?
Yeah, so the reason not to do that is that person's being paid to do that job. So I suppose, it's like if, I don't know, would it be saying, oh, thank you so much for being here, but first we need to thank the support worker for being here as well, or, thank you to the guide dog for being here. Like, it's a bit like, no, I'm here representing me. You don't need to thank, someone who's being here in a paid capacity to do their job. And particularly in many situations where, we're thanking and recognising the paid person, but often I'm, again, as I just talked about, in a volunteer capacity, I should be being thanked for volunteering to come and do this. And again, if you were able to sign, we wouldn't need this service anyway. And as someone who works as an interpreter, it is also really uncomfortable when you're referred to as an interpreter. You're there trying to do a job and you are not that job. And so it actually makes it more difficult to do your job when people are talking about you, because then you're then having to interpret that. And, that often happens. We know that it happens on television quite a lot where people refer to the interpreter. But the point is the interpreter is there for the deaf community. Like, refer to the deaf community. That's why that person is there. That's what we need. We need people to be celebrating and acknowledging the deaf community, not the interpreter that's providing access to that community. And also, so that's why for a lot of our events we have a deaf acknowledgement, as that goes alongside our Indigenous acknowledgement that acknowledges the deaf community.
Drisana, we'll get into you in a sec, but you did mention something before, especially around interviews and that, and how much of a I guess barrier is it for you, but also how much culturally has it changed, especially for organizations who now need to invest in interpreters, so it's not always on you to be able to then contribute, in society like you want to do? Because I think that is that culture changing where people are doing it, or is that still, I know it still is a barrier, but how much is it getting better, and how much does it alienate yourself and the community when people don't understand that, and rather than do it, just say it's too hard and not bother?
I mean, it really depends. So I think if we go back to looking at the human right to participate, essentially, it's not, from my point of view, an organisation saying they don't have the funds to do something to make something accessible or for me to be able to participate is not acceptable. And here in WA, I really need to acknowledge a lot of the deaf advocacy and leadership that has occurred in the past. So we have a state language policy here in WA that says anything government related, government services, that's state or local government, or if it's funded by a state or local government, it must be, interpreters must be provided. And so that also includes for foreign languages in Australia as well. We know in Australia that we have TIS, the telephone interpreting service, which is a free service for those who are using spoken languages. But for us who are using Auslan, we can't use that free federally funded service. And we have to often come back to those organisations again and again. But by having that policy in place, that does mean that when it's a government provided service, we often get interpreters. So one of the things that we also have in place now is NDIS. However, that also can be a little bit of a black hole for people like myself. I've been living in Canada for the last 3 years. I'm now back in Australia and I'm hoping to be here permanently, or at least for some time. But at the moment, I can't see a health professional because I can't get access to interpreting because I do not have NDIS, having lived outside of Australia. And so again, we used to have separate funding for medical appointments, but when the NDIS was introduced, it then got put into the NDIS. And the only way to see a doctor with an interpreter is through funding I don't have access to currently. And one of the things that we often see is a lot of services that were provided previously were put into the NDIS, but many deaf people may not be eligible for those funds. So they used to receive services that they no longer are eligible to receive.
Yeah, I commissioned a report around the NDIS through my consulting firm, GSA, and this was one of the big things is, first and foremost, talking about how awesome the NDIS is for the majority of it, right? Because we often forget that. But the second part is there is only 500,000 people in the NDIS, and there are 4.5 million people with disabilities. So for those other 4 million people, there is an element where all the services went towards the NDIS. And what happens to people on the DSP, on the aged care, people that don't receive that? And Drisana, you nailed it, because if you don't, you've got to not just go, all right, here's the shiny new toy, which is the NDIS, and then if you're not in that, you lose those opportunities to get services. You might not need a full NDIS package like someone else who might be profoundly deaf. Who knows? It's all different. But you still also need to be looked after to make sure you get the services so you can contribute to our social, economic, educational growth within the country.
Absolutely. And I wonder if, it's because the Australian government thinks that, we should stay home and we should be grateful. And particularly to myself, I moved out of Australia and went overseas for career opportunities, which are career opportunities I could never have here in Australia. So I was interpreting Canadian broadcast television and Parliament, which is something we absolutely can't do here. And so I move out of the country for better career opportunities. And when I come back, I can't even see a doctor. And I think it's because the Australian government thinks we should just be in our homes, grateful to be alive in this country. And we're often, particularly for those of us that are looking at professional careers, we're certainly not supported in any way to have professional careers.
So, and just while we're on that, because I was going to ask you later, Auslan, Australian Sign Language, Canadian Sign Language, different language? Did you have to learn that when you went there? And can you explain to our listeners who might not know that about, but I 100% know for a fact, a lot of able-bodied people think there is one sign language all around the world, but I know that is not true. Can you give us a bit of a little education around that?
Absolutely, you're right. Sign languages are different around the world. There is no universal sign language, just as there are with spoken languages. There's no universal natural spoken language. So I had to learn ASL, American Sign Language, which is used in Canada. And for me, I think I was quite lucky, quite privileged. I grew up as a native user of Auslan with a deaf family. I travelled a lot, so I've been to over 30 countries. I've lived overseas as well, and so that helped me really be immersed into other sign languages whenever I have travelled. And in North America, from about 2014 onwards, I was sort of based both here in Perth and wherever my husband was living. He was living in the US for a lot of that time. So we lived in New York for a while, right in the center of Manhattan. Then my husband moved to Washington, D.C. Then we moved to Austin, Texas. And as I said, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been based in Vancouver. So part of that means I've been able to be immersed because I'm using that language on a daily basis. After about 8 years, I was then approached by people in the deaf community to become a deaf interpreter in ASL. And that, I think, is what's really important. Is it's not that I went, oh, I can do this and I'm going to become an interpreter in a different sign language that isn't my native sign language. Deaf people approached me to do that, which gives you a lot more sort of status and credibility in a community when that happens. And I then worked with an incredible team of deaf interpreters on broadcast television. So these weren't hearing interpreters. They were all deaf interpreters on broadcast TV. It was a huge honour and a great privilege to do that. But yeah, so the short answer is yes, they're very, very different languages. And I became fluent because I lived over there for at least 8 years prior to then becoming an interpreter.
A follow-up question to that then, because I am one of the people that Dylan referenced. Up until very recently, I didn't realise ASL and Auslan were different, and BSL, British Sign Language, American Sign Language, Australian Sign Language. I didn't know that was different. That was my ignorance. I'm very happy to be learning about it more now. But what are some of the... is there a base level of communication? Is it like kind of slang and nuance that's different between languages? Or is it, literally completely different? It's like myself trying to learn French at the moment on Duolingo.
Between Auslan and American Sign Language, completely different. So often it's not only the language, there's cultural nuances in there. And again, it's often related to whatever the country is that language is being used in. That's where a lot of those differences come from. Having learned one sign language, one of the things that does happen is that you often have more ability to use space, to use a visual, gestural, spatial language, and you're more comfortable to pick up your hands and move your body in ways that may not seem natural if you're a spoken language user. However, so it's not that being fluent in one sign language makes you more fluent in another sign language, but I think it makes you more able to separate spoken languages and sign languages, because spoken languages have nothing to do with sign languages and vice versa. And I think it makes you more able to appreciate parts about those sign languages so that you're then able to learn them more effectively.
Gus, how cool is this? Drisana, correct me if I'm wrong. In the UK, every show can be signed in BSL. So like on TV. So if you're watching The Block, the news, My Kitchen Rules, MasterChef, whatever, how cool is that, Gus? You can get a BSL box, and it's awesome. We don't. Is that right?
Oh, I love it. Yeah, love it.
Yeah, how cool is that? Why don't we do that here?
But they had to fight for the interpreters to. So they do that, but they have to fight for the interpreters to do emergency news announcements. So you can have an interpreter for The Block, but not that there's COVID. And again, it's just the UK has had an incredible deaf community. And I mean, that's all over the world. Deaf communities all over the world having to advocate. Often when they're going through, they've got barriers to even be able to do that advocacy. And, having to fight systemic oppression to be able to advocate against it. But yeah, you're right. When I was traveling in the UK, I was there earlier this year, and it was amazing being able to watch deaf interpreters on TV, signing programs. It was great. And I would love to see more of that here.
In that moment, I know everybody's different, but if someone from another country is signing, sees you sign, do you like it that they would come up and try and say good day to you? Or are you like, just because we're deaf doesn't mean we have to communicate with each other? Where do you sit?
I think within deaf culture, within the deaf community, if you see someone else signing, you recognise and say hello to each other. Whether that's a deaf person or a hearing person, we often do make that connection because we don't see as much of that. We don't see a lot of people signing. And when you go overseas, often when you meet a deaf person overseas, you see them signing, that's where you find out, like, what are services like in this country? How, is there a great tour I can go to? Those sorts of things. Whereas, if I'm just out at the groceries or something and I'm buying something and an Auslan student wants to have a chat, sometimes I'm a little bit like, I just want to get my food and go home. But again, anytime that you see people signing is great. The only thing is to be cautious of is maybe those two people actually having an argument and coming in at that point saying, hi, how are you? Isn't great. Because again, when there's not very many people around who sign, sometimes the things that we say to each other in public, people can't understand. I'll share an example. So, as you know, I've been living in Canada. And so hearing people don't know who I am in Canada, why would they? Of course not. But I forgot that there may be people who know me from Australia who might be in Canberra. My brother and I were on the same flight. So this is when we've come back here. We're going to Brisbane. I happen to be on the same flight as my brother. And this random person who was going to the toilet came up, stopped, saw me, started signing, and was sort of, quite slowly saying, hello, are you Drisana? And I was like, yes, I am. And then she was like, oh, I love your work. I follow you on Instagram. And here's all these signs I've learnt. And I had that moment of realizing, I'm back in Australia where people recognize me because I've had a bit of a platform over here that I haven't had elsewhere. And then I was like, I have to remember to, look my best when I leave my house because people might know who I am. And again, it's not about fame or anything. It's just that when you have a bit more of a platform in a certain place, people recognize you more. And I'm happy for people to approach me. I like to think that I'm quite approachable. But for other people, I can't really respond on their behalf. I would say if you see someone signing, see what the vibe is of what they're signing maybe before you go up and say hello, as you would if you were, I don't know, overseas and you heard someone speaking a language you know. Maybe get the vibe of what they're saying before approaching them.
We just spoke briefly about the deaf community, and last time we spoke years ago, I think it was on Netflix. The show Deaf You had come out, and I do remember us having a really great conversation because you described it so well. And I remember walking away from that interview going, "Oh God, I now have such a greater understanding about the community as a whole," because it can be well on this TV show they kind of interpreted it as quite a device or a rift between people who use their spoken voice and people who exclusively sign. For people who wouldn't know anything about the community of people who also use cochlear implants or hearing aids as well, can you talk about the community broadly and discuss for people who would have no idea about the community?
Yeah, I mean, there's no real divide as much as maybe that program made it seem like. In Deaf You, they still worked together. It wasn't, you speak and you sign and therefore never the twain shall meet. The deaf community and we are very diverse. And I think that this is a perception that might be made by the medical field, who think that if deaf people aren't using their voice and aren't using technology, that they must hate people who do and hate that technology. And I think, no, I mean, if it works for you, that's great. If a cochlear implant or a hearing aid is effective for you, that's great. Our main thing is about Auslan. Auslan saves us and is our community. We had one person who was just recently in the deaf community, and at their birthday, this was their birthday party. They had 30 or 40 people come to their birthday party, and it was the first time they'd ever had people at their birthday party. Growing up, they'd had hearing friends, they'd struggled in a mainstream environment, and had only ever had one or two friends their whole life. So in their, late 20s, finally having a birthday party and having 30, 40 people come, and she could talk to all of them. So she had sent all these invites out thinking, oh, no one will come, just like they did when I was at school. And yet all these people came and she had all these friends, and you just have to think about why she didn't have that growing up. So in the deaf community, we never talk about someone's abilities to speak or whether that's a positive or a negative. We often just talk about the relief of having a safe space where we can be deaf and we can do whatever it is that we need to do as deaf people when we're not judged by hearing people. Because in the hearing world, it's exhausting trying to figure out what people are saying all the time, all of those sort of barriers that we have. The deaf community is a safe space regardless of whatever tools or methods you use outside isn't important. It's more about it's a safe space and a support system. But I think there's often that perception from others.
Now, one thing that we wanted to talk to you about is something that you've kind of termed deaf gain. So can you tell us a bit about what deaf gain is and why it's important to you? Because I don't think many people, if they follow you, they know about it. But, people listening wouldn't have heard you speak about it before.
Summary about deaf gain, it's a really beautiful concept because at the end of the day, we're not less than because we're deaf, which is the perception of hearing loss. We have actually gained by being deaf people. So I'm bilingual and I'm bicultural, and I'm actually now multilingual and multicultural. Our brains have different capabilities, perhaps. And I'll use my husband as an example. He grew up in South Africa, profoundly deaf. He's never used any devices or anything like that. And he grew up trilingual. So he grew up using South African Sign Language, Afrikaans, so written Afrikaans and written English, as his 3 languages. He's now fluent in 9 different languages. He is a successful CEO of Convo World. So, and in that he looks after 5 different ventures in 5 different countries. So that's a telephone interpreting solution, and we've just launched into a new country. He's an Order of a Baobab, which is like an OAM but South African. And so he's done some incredible things, which shows that it has nothing to do with his hearing. He's not heard a single thing in his life. That's all gain from being deaf, from having access to different languages. And I think that that concept of deaf gain also shows that, you know, we have deaf art, we have deaf history, we have deaf culture, we have deaf theatre, we have all these other forms of expression that come from being deaf. And many of the countries that I've travelled to around the world, I think maybe there might be maybe 1 or 2 where I've had to pay for accommodation. Everywhere else, I've stayed with friends of friends, because in the deaf community, you know, that's deaf gain. If you know someone who knows someone who knows someone, you've got a villa to stay at.
You just while we're on that with languages, it's important just to teach people that are listening, because I know the answer to this, but I want everyone else to know it. Hearing loss, hearing impaired in the bin, correct? So what's the correct terminology for anyone who wants to understand and get it right?
Well, for us, we tend to use deaf and hard of hearing. We have, at an international level, the World Federation of the Deaf, and they have signed an MOU with the International Federation of Hard of Hearing Persons. So at international level, representing people who are deaf and hard of hearing, we have one who uses the term deaf and one who uses the term hard of hearing. And individuals' labels are up to them, but when we are talking about a collective, we should use those terms that are coming from those international bodies. And again, a lot of that is about what's unique to a person, and we don't want to debate on an individual, you know, how an individual chooses to identify themselves. But again, that term hearing impaired implies that we're impaired, that we have a loss, that we're missing something, and we aren't. It's also important to think that a lot of those labels are actually given to people by the medical community, for example. And for many of us who are deaf, we talk about being deaf in a proud way. We don't talk about deaf as a deficit. And I've met people who are profoundly deaf who might use the term hard of hearing because they choose to speak, for example, even though they might actually be profoundly deaf as a medical term. So there's different ways that people might identify. I know people who would be classified as hard of hearing in a medical system, but call themselves deaf because they use Auslan, because they're very proud to be a deaf person. So again, those individual labels are one thing, but often some of those labels can come from that systematic oppression that comes from the medical view of how we're looked at. However, as a deaf community, we're often going through that journey as we grow up. We're sort of unpacking labels that are given to us. We're unpacking assumptions made about us up until a point where we're able to then very clearly state whether we have a deaf or a hard of hearing identity. And often that's something that deaf people as a collective have known for many, many years, but we often have to work through those perspectives and the way that people are labeling us as we grow up.
And I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody, but it goes, because I don't have this experience, but it goes for the same of vision impairment and vision loss. It would be blind and low vision as well these days.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Take note, everyone listening. Drisana, it is time for our bowl of uncomfortable. I can't remember the question that we asked you 2 years ago, but we'll move on to ones that we have created this time round. I actually have 2 for you, so I'll go, then Dylan will go, then I'll go again. This one comes through from our Instagram DMs, wondering and asking, obviously not to offend, but how do you listen in your way to music, or is there a way to interpret music as somebody who is profoundly deaf?
That is a great question. I love music. I'm obsessed with it. And this year I have started to, with support of some really great friends in the deaf community, I've started to do some more sign singing, which is something that I love to do. And I think because often there's a perspective that music isn't accessible to deaf people, but I know a lot of deaf people who love music. Hearing aids aren't effective for me anymore. However, I do use headphones and inner ear plugs, but like turned up really loud. And also, if it is a song that I really love, I will listen to it on repeat and read the lyrics, and it essentially becomes like muscle memory where I'm like training my brain to hear the music. So while I'm listening to it, I'm reading the lyrics at the same time so I can sort of figure out where those words are. Sometimes I might shadow an interpreter, so I might have an interpreter sign those lyrics so I know where they are, and then I'll then interpret those lyrics and do more of a sign song type of thing. So then once I've got it really well rehearsed, I can then I'll often record myself, and then I can actually remove the music from out of my ears, and I can still essentially hear it when I watch my own interpreting of it. But I love music. One of my dreams, what I would love to do, again, is I've been interpreting on television, which was one of my dreams, but I would love to do some interpreting of like some concerts, maybe Ed Sheeran if you're out there listening, Taylor Swift if you're out there listening, just a little plug maybe.
Well, there is a fantastic music festival in Australia called Ability Fest, where there are interpreters. So if you play your cards right, you never know. Could get a call up. All right,
yes,
Mike.
Please. Yep. I actually need to attend.
Done.
Because yes, I would love to interpret. I would love to attend.
All right, you're coming. Now, mine comes from Ryan on Instagram. If you are really frustrated with someone who isn't signing back, can't sign back at you, how do you yell to get your point across? So first and foremost, how would you like emphasize to someone who is deaf when you're signing, but also in just general population, if someone really pisses you off, and how do you communicate with them to get your point across?
Well, so do you mean to a deaf person or to a hearing person? Or
both. I want to hear both. Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't often get angry, I suppose. I think there's too much anger and hate and, people being miserable in the world. So I try not to. As I said, we've just lost a couple of friends last week, and that's not an uncommon occurrence, sadly, in our community. And so I try not to then get that out into the world even further. I try to sort of make a bit of an invisible line. That being said, I do think people need to work together, and I try to give someone an opportunity, particularly if it's hearing people who often have never met a deaf person before. I'm sure it's very confronting when I'm standing in their face signing at them. So, you take it very softly and lots of nice big gestures and sort of baby talk kind of signing that you might do to, bring them in gently. I mean, if they're just flat out being rude and discriminatory, then I might get a little bit more edgy perhaps, but again, it's a process, and often I might just decide not worth my time. If it's another deaf person who can sign, however, then absolutely, if you're expressing emotions, that all happens through your facial expression, through your body language, through how your hands are moving. And I'm sure if you asked my husband, we've been together for 10 years, we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, I'm sure if you asked him, he would be able to tell you straight away that simply because of how I was signing something or a slight shift of an eyebrow or something like that, he would absolutely know what I was feeling at that particular time. If I was angry, then often the signs get much bigger, becomes a lot more obvious. It's more like this kind of stuff going on. So it's obvious, I think, most of the time for people who know sign language, and even for people who don't. But again, at the end of the day, I think we all need to be a bit more open-minded and a bit more open-hearted, and there is too much anger and sadness and grief, and I'd prefer to see things better, and I prefer my friends to stay alive, and so putting positivity out is a much better way to do that than negativity.
Like it.
Love it. Thank you. The final question of this interview of ListenABLE with you, Drisana, it comes from me. 2 years ago, our podcast incorrectly filmed our last interview, meaning we needed to reschedule. Apart from the obvious, make sure everyone was filmed, what could we have done better in that situation? Did you see any ableism? How was our communication? And what could we have done better to suit you, your disability, and the situation?
No, I think, that was an unfortunate incident. I just think thank you for that opportunity, because having this podcast and having interviews with people who have got authentic lived experiences is really important. And for us to be allies with each other for our, respective issues, I think that's really important for deaf and disabled people to be allies together. And I think part of it might be, maybe one suggestion is about volunteering for these interviews. Like, I'm very happy to volunteer, but as you would know, often in the deaf and disabled community, we are often asked to volunteer a lot of work when we should be paid for that work. Again, this podcast, I'm not particularly concerned about, because, we're allies and this is great and a great experience. But just generally, often, while I am very happy to answer people's questions, whether, however stupid they might be, but there's a certain point where answering a question becomes, you need to be paying me for these answers, if you know what I mean. Like, there's always that line, I think, as deaf and disabled people, where it stops being just gentle questioning and I'm happy to volunteer this information to, no, you need to be paying me to consult. That doesn't apply to this, though. I just want to say I'm very, very happy to chat with both of you.
Send your invoice. Send it in.
But again, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a pleasure. I really, really enjoyed this second time round.
Well, the great thing about our podcast is hopefully someone is out there needing professional services as a motivational or keynote speaker, Auslan, an accessibility consultant. We have Drisana's links below. You can be one click away from working with this incredible advocate in this space, and we can't thank you sincerely enough from both of us, not only to do this once today, but to do it a second time. I think the rehearsal paid off.
You legend.
No worries. Thank you.